The Caribbean might seem like an unlikely location for a heavily contested aspect of World War II at first glance, but a closer inspection shows just how complicated and vital this region was, so we'll try and cover it at least in a brief high-level overview. Now, although some of the Central and South American nations were roughly as they are today, and several of the Caribbean islands were also independent, large swathes of territory were still ruled by various colonial powers. The British had enclaves on the mainland and control over many of the smaller islands. The Dutch held control of a few islands, including some very important ones in the south. The US had a few holdings, and the French held the balance of the colonial possessions over in the eastern part of the Caribbean. Now, initially, as a result, the Caribbean was actually a relatively peaceful place, as all the territory was held by either neutrals or members of the Allies. But then the Germans invaded Western Europe, and suddenly the Dutch government found itself in exile, the French Atlantic ports were in German hands, and Vichy France, which from the start, but still more so after the events of Mers Kabir, Alexandria, and various other places, was increasingly hostile to the Allies. And this latter was not just an idle threat. In the dying days of organised resistance in France, signals had gone out ordering numerous French warships to take refuge in the harbour of Fort-de-France in Martinique, which incidentally happens to show the period and current claims that the French were forced to return all major warships to mainland France to be something of a lie, as the collection that swung at anchor there included well over 100 land-based military aircraft, as well as the sole French aircraft carrier, Béarn, and the cruisers Jeanne d'Arc and Émile Bertin, as well as a number of lesser warships and armed merchant cruisers. Now, there was a chance that these vessels could then be mobilised against Allied interests should Vichy France become progressively more hostile, and or the island and other French holdings in the area might be used to resupply or as full-on operational bases by German U-boats, which otherwise might struggle to operate in the area for substantial periods of time, even though they now had access to ports in mainland France on the French Atlantic coast, rather than having to come all the way from Germany. But with all these concerns, the list of potential targets was quite long. The Dutch Oil Refinery on the island of Curaçao was the largest in the world at the time, churning out millions of barrels of oil per day. The refinery on Trinidad was the largest oil refinery under British control in the world, and there was another major Dutch oil facility on the island of Aruba. Although initially neutral and semi-protecting the area under the auspices of the Pan-American Security Zone, by the end of 1941 the United States of America could add its own interests to that list. There were oil refineries and factories on the southern US coast. There was, of course, the Atlantic end of the Panama Canal, access to the Mississippi River, the raw materials trade, especially in bauxite or aluminium ore from South America, and, of course, the oil fields of Venezuela, which supplied everybody to varying degrees, since the Middle Eastern oil fields were both not as well developed as they would be in the latter half of the 20th century, and Italian involvement in the war by this point had made easy shipment of what oil that area did produce difficult for supporting anything other than operations in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Outside of the resources developed and processed in the area, the Caribbean was also a point of major throughput for American warships built on the East Coast, which were then being funneled into the Pacific War effort, and was also the assembly point for a number of convoy series that gathered various goods produced in the United States, which were then shipped to its southern ports and then loaded for transport along the US coast to the northeastern US harbours and their Canadian equivalents, whereupon they'd be handed over to transatlantic convoys, albeit that in the initial stages of what we're about to recount, these merchant sailings were independent, the convoy system only coming in somewhat later. But the movement of trade was there, regardless of what particular form it took. In addition to all of this, there was a very busy local trade in food, oil, and general raw materials that supplied the various countries and islands that happened to be in or near the Caribbean, which was a neutral trade that overlaid the Allied war-related traffic. And, of course, quite a number of these raw foodstuffs and other raw materials were also being traded to the Allies, even if they weren't quite as vital as the oil and bauxite trade. As the situation in Europe had obviously deteriorated, British troops had been sent to garrison the vital Dutch refineries with the agreement of the Dutch government in exile. These would later be replaced with American troops once the US joined the war, and initially there had been some French troops involved as well, but they'd had to move off once France had fallen. But this rearranging of basic defensive organisation ended when the first major blows were struck by the Kriegsmarine. These would come in February 1942, when a total of 6 German Type 9C U-boats, the U-67, U-126, U-129, U-156, U-161 and U-502, launched attacks across the Caribbean, supported by 5 Italian submarines which were assigned to watch the Atlantic entrances of the major shipping channels, those subs being the Morosini, Enrico Tazzoli, Giuseppe Finzi, Leonardo da Vinci and Luigi Torelli. The campaign had 2 primary objectives. Firstly, the absolute top priority targets were oil tankers. These were less common vessels, they were harder to build, and they were absolutely vital to the Allied war effort. Dry bulk goods, from grain to tanks to bananas, could, in theory at least, be transported in almost any ship that had cargo capacity if you absolutely had to, even though results in terms of preservation might vary. But the movement of oil and oil products was a highly specialised trade, and it required specialised ships. Secondary was the priority areas of operation that had been identified: the Windward Passage, the Curaçao-Aruba Passage, and the area around Trinidad. Whilst these all contained high numbers of oil tankers, they were also choke points where almost all other Caribbean merchant traffic had to pass at some point or other during their various voyages, and the U-boats were not being particularly discriminatory in who they sank. This campaign was made possible by a confluence of factors: the range available with the Type 9C U-boat, the fact that the US had entered the war without much in the way of anti-submarine warfare escorts or anti-submarine warfare doctrine for what was almost its own home waters, a fact that other Kriegsmarine submarines were also exploiting on the east coast at the time, and of course the cooperation of Vichy France, which was allowing the Kriegsmarine to use Martinique and some other French islands to refuel and resupply the U-boats, albeit not authorising the Vichy warships to actually go out and act directly in the campaign, the latter distinction being a factor which just about tipped the balance of US military opinion on the continued existence of the French facilities, as the US Navy had drawn up various invasion plans for all Vichy-held territory in the area, but there was a fairly big difference between knowing that U-boats were occasionally using French holdings to rest and resupply or to offload wounded, and proving that to the degree that would justify an invasion. Whereas if Vichy cruisers or aircraft were out there sinking tankers, that would be a fairly unequivocal cause for war and would give the Allies much greater freedom of action. In the space of the first 2 months of the offensive, a heavy toll was exacted on Allied shipping. Just under 60 ships were hit, most of which were sunk, although a few did limp into port in need of major repairs, of which no less than 27 were precious oil tankers. A number of others were the almost as valuable bauxite freighters, and one was a neutral Brazilian vessel. U-156 also attempted to bombard the refinery facilities on Aruba with its 4-inch deck gun, although this was fortunately thwarted by the fact that the crew had forgotten to remove the gun's tampion, which meant that the gun exploded on the first shot. A general strafing of the area with the 37mm anti-aircraft gun, the only other weapon on board capable of hitting targets on land, failed to excite any significant results bar one slight dent in an oil tank. The sub was thus forced to content itself with only torpedoing ships in harbour instead. This series of attacks, dubbed Operation Neuland, was incredibly successful both in material and morale terms, as tanker crews now refused to sail, and other routes, including the vital bauxite link, were temporarily suspended, all of which denied the Allies still more vital resources, because of course an oil tanker that doesn't sail, in terms of oil delivered to the point where it's needed, is pretty much as bad as that oil tanker having been sunk. The only annoyance for the Axis was the failure of the deck gun at Aruba, and a month after the main offensive of Operation Neuland was over, another attempt to bombard the Dutch facilities at Curaçao likewise ended in failure. This time the gun didn't explode, but all the shells that were fired missed their intended target, and the U-boat was then forced to withdraw by a Dutch shore battery. These events forced a number of changes to Allied operations, albeit some of them were slow in coming. More aircraft and anti-submarine warfare ships were deployed, and a vast range of convoys began to be organised over the spring and summer of 1942. Despite being geographically one of the smallest areas covered by the convoy system, and unlike the Mediterranean, lacking direct enemy coastline, unless of course you counted the Vichy holdings, the sheer multiplicity of potential start and destination points, both internally and externally, meant that there were about as many Caribbean convoy designations as there are for any other major theatre, such as the much larger North Atlantic, as each convoy designation consisted of a pair of letters that designated in some way, shape or form the start and end point, and then was reversed for the return convoy. As Axis submarine efforts expanded, other critical supplies such as chromium supplied from Cuba, as well as nickel and tungsten from South America, came under threat. But of all the raw materials outside of oil, the bauxite trade was very firmly the second greatest priority. 98% of all US aluminium, or aluminum if you're in the States, was made from bauxite that transited through the Caribbean. Without those supplies, amongst various other things, US pilots would have to start learning to fly with aircraft that were either made from wood and canvas or steel sheeting, neither of which were particularly attractive if you wanted a high-performance aircraft that was going to live more than 5 minutes against Zeros or Bf-109s. That said, the Axis efforts weren't going completely their own way. The attacks on shipping provoked Mexico to declare war on Germany, and various ostensibly neutral countries accepted Allied air bases or garrisons to secure trade in the area, since the export of raw materials formed a significant part of their own economic base and they didn't want to see it sunk by Axis submarines. This, of course, then further complicated the job of the Axis submarines as they were being attacked or monitored from the air from all sorts of different directions. Whilst Allied anti-submarine warfare efforts were increasing, they were at the same time being hampered by inter-service rivalry within the United States Armed Forces and problems coordinating international forces. The United States Army Air Force believed that their shiny new B-24s should be sent actively hunting U-boats, whereas the US Navy believed that they should be used to escort convoys. And as a result of the disagreement, the US Army Air Force refused to give the US Navy operational control over their B-24 units, although they were a little bit more liberal with the conversion and use of the otherwise obsolete B-18 bomber units, which, despite a laundry list of deficiencies, did actually manage to attack a number of U-boats on Caribbean patrols and sank U-654 in late August 1942, one of the first U-boats to be sunk by a US aircraft, and 2 months later they also dealt with the U-512. Service-based forces initially consisted of a dozen small US Navy craft ranging from a couple of destroyers and the gunboat Erie to a trio of converted yachts, plus around half a dozen older submarines. There were also some Royal Navy corvettes, a couple of Dutch ships, and soon enough some Brazilian vessels present, as escalating attacks on their merchant fleet had led to Brazil declaring war on Germany in August 1942. But with so many shipping lanes to cover, as well as at least 3 separate languages and 2 different sets of measurements to deal with, efforts to get convoys organised were slow, not helped by the fact that the US Navy under Admiral King saw the theatre as the USA's own backyard, but the only people with any significant anti-submarine warfare experience, and thus the ones who would have to lead the convoy escorts, were the British. and Admiral King was not particularly thrilled with that particular set of circumstances. But, in an unlikely turn of events, a degree of salvation came from a group of private industry lobbyists. The representatives of various US oil companies who were watching their ships and revenues vanish in one fireball after another. They prevailed upon the US president that if something wasn't done soon, then not only would the US be unable to sustain its planned war effort the following year for lack of oil, but their own considerable coffers might well, in that instance, be directed to supporting other politicians. Rather swiftly, the US Navy and Admiral King were ordered to get convoys sorted out, no matter who led them and no matter how many escorts were available. Soon, new PBY Catalinas, along with anti-submarine warfare trawlers and other assets, were being sent into the area, but by the end of spring 1942, the Axis submarines had traded one of their own for almost 200 Allied ships in their combined operations off the US East Coast and in the Caribbean. As the first convoys were organised along the east coast, this had a temporary effect of diverting the U-boats to the still largely unorganised tropical waters of the Caribbean, and losses amongst the tankers and freighters there rose still further as spring turned into summer. German Milchkau resupply U-boats were dispatched to the area, and the number of attacking submarines was doubled from an average of 5 to an average of 10. And June 1942 would see another 66 ships sunk and 3 more damaged. But, luckily, by this point, the convoy system was starting to take hold, and not only had the various navies that were already involved stepped up their presence, but other navies, such as the Royal Canadian Navy, were beginning to show up in force themselves, as many of the cargoes would be heading either to or via their ports. And even though August saw 26 Axis submarines operating in the Caribbean, they would only manage 44 kills in exchange for 7 German and 6 Italian submarines lost whilst involved in these operations, either killed directly in the Caribbean area or whilst they were on their way to or from the operational area. This includes subs that went aground, subs that disappeared, probably hitting mines, and so forth. So whilst things were starting to look up at sea by summer 1942, there was another side to the conflict that often goes unrecorded, with various freighters being requisitioned to replace lost ships, and thus now carrying war material, along with more general losses to the merchant fleet. Many islands began to run short on everything from gasoline to tyres to food and cooking products. And this in turn forced many islands, including Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Barbados and Trinidad, to severely ration what was left. This, of course, rapidly led to black markets and opportunists who found loopholes in the rapidly passed laws. For example, on one island, bread was rationed, and it was mandated that a loaf of bread should be sold at a fixed price. Sandwiches, however, were not rationed, and so sellers began to slice up all of their bread loaves and only selling sandwiches, which thus allowed them to charge whatever they wanted. Eventually, to deal with these shady practices, different nations and authorities brought in different measures. On British islands, for example, they brought in a 3-tier subsidy system. At the first tier, the government bought the provisions in question at a fixed price and then sold them at a lower price, or distributed them free of charge in the form of rations. This was the case, for example, with bananas in Jamaica. At the second level, the local government, as opposed to the overall government, would buy the provisions and sell them at a lower price. And at the third level, both the local and the overarching governmental authorities would reduce or eliminate tariffs on imports and exports during the war, thus allowing certain foodstuffs to be moved from one island to another where there might be shortages or needs, regardless of who exactly happened to own that particular island. As this lowered the cost of basic supplies right from the source, it proved to be a relatively effective, if somewhat governmentally expensive way of cutting out most of the profiteers. On US-controlled islands, a coupon system for the goods in shorter supply was introduced, And a number of islands also introduced measures to vastly increase the cultivation of subsistence foods over the cash crops that had largely been grown there before, which in turn would alleviate some of the local issues, but would actually have unintended larger knock-on effects, as the export crops of sugar, bananas, and so forth would no longer be available into the wider world in such large quantities as they had been before, which would then lead to further rationing overseas. The UK famously being without or very short of bananas for so long that in the post-war environment some children had grown up not knowing what they were, having never seen them before, and were then seen trying to figure out this strange fruit that they'd never encountered by trying to eat them like apples, i.e. biting into them skin and all. And yes, there are in fact late 1940s pamphlets on how to eat a banana that were published in the UK, because a bunch of people, as I said, had either forgotten or never known. Nonetheless, going back to the Caribbean, Cuba, for example, had the obligatory cultivation of rice, corn, beans, peanuts, and other similar food crops, except for sugarcane, which was considered a cash crop, and cattle farmers were also permitted to raise pigs, whereas before that had been forbidden. On Haiti, the destruction, removal, or replacement of any subsistence crops that were planted on land controlled by the Haitian Department of Agriculture was criminalized to avoid people trying to plant cash crops in their place. On Barbados, the government required farmers to plant and cultivate a minimum of 1/3 of their arable acreage with one or more of the following: beans, cassava, corn, cotton, green vegetables, peas, sweet potatoes, or yams. The use of fertilizer for sugarcane production in the remaining land was also heavily curtailed so that it could be redirected to the subsistence crop growing areas, and the raising of livestock, wherever there was land suitable for it, was made compulsory. In Jamaica, they simply reserved a specific proportion of the overall arable land for subsistence food cultivation, and in Trinidad, they took a significant portion of the land that had previously been used for sugarcane, and this was then turned over to be planted with short-term, quick-growth subsistence crops such as beans and peas. The Allies also distributed fishing gear to various islands to encourage the uptake of this industry, which would then reduce the need for imported meat. And new industries would also begin to take root, as access to certain materials, everything from sponges to sisal and jute, was either cut off or made significantly harder when you looked at where these things had been sourced from in pre-war times. As dangerous as the Caribbean seas might be, there was at least a chance that you could ship these goods out of there, whereas, say, Japan was unlikely to be exporting loofah sponges to the Allies anytime soon. The only thing the Japanese of 1942 were interested in exporting to the Allies was various combinations of explosives and metal, delivered, of course, by express high-speed delivery services. In particular, the sisal and jute industries took off in a big way, as the cloth and bags that could be made from them could be combined with just the simple raw materials of them for packaging other produce, and then the raw materials and the cloths and the bags that were packaging all the fruit and other raw materials that were being sent over from the Caribbean could themselves be reused or manufactured in the US and UK for other purposes. A simple Allied sandbag absorbing bullets to defend the troops hiding behind it in Normandy in 1944, for example, might well have started out life as a bundle of fibres that was being used to keep exported goods from the Caribbean from jostling around too much in a cargo ship's hold. It would have then been removed in, say, the Liverpool docks, processed and weaved into a bag, and then sent on to the front lines. Propaganda was something else that the Allies had to play catch-up on, as initially they'd taken the view that suppression of bad news was the best approach. But in spring and part of summer 1942, with only really bad news happening, the Allied broadcasts had gone pretty quiet. But on small islands, the absence of particular ships and the failure to return of their crews was noticed pretty quickly, and word spread. With no official information, the German broadcasts were often the only source of news on shipping losses. And whilst the Germans did, of course, slightly exaggerate their success and played down their losses, they were actually pretty smart and kept what they said to something approaching the realms of the plausible, which then combined with local chatter to have significant additional effect. Gradually, after much unneeded tension had arisen, the Allies eventually got the message, and their own transmissions began to discuss, albeit somewhat circumspectly, some of the ongoing losses, as well as developing various other programs to try and reassure people that they weren't being forgotten, and that the various occupation troops would in fact leave at the end of the war, something else that the German transmissions had been suggesting was somewhat unlikely, and considering that a good chunk of the independent Caribbean, Central and South American nations had just about finished throwing off colonial oppressors, a fair number had been quite worried that this was just imperialism by the back door. And this brings us back round to the French possessions in the Caribbean, which were a source of tension between the US and the UK in the early part of the war, as the US initially largely wanted to have friendly relations with the Vichy government, and the British didn't. However, as a result, the Americans had much greater success in actually monitoring the French holdings, as they were able to get a degree of Vichy compliance. It, in part, has to be said, due to an agreement that they would supply food, medicine and money to the islands, which were otherwise cut off from the rest of the world. However, as time went on and the Vichy government became more and more aligned with the Nazis, the US began to align its own view more and more with that of the British. By the time the U-boat campaign had hit its height in late spring 1942, the US was demanding the immobilization of almost all French naval and air assets in the area, something that was eventually acceded to, given the overwhelming presence of American firepower a few hundred miles away, as compared to the relatively anemic war machine of Vichy France, which was, in any case, for the most part, stuck on the other side of the Atlantic. This also had the benefit of forcing German submarines away from using the major French colonies as resupply bases, and as 1942 drew onwards and Operation Torch was launched over in the Mediterranean, all contacts with the Vichy government were severed, and an embargo and propaganda campaign was launched against the French islands instead. The French Caribbean Territory governor, Admiral Robert, was forced to make further concessions to get the US to reopen basic trade, but by this point pro-Free French sentiment was beginning to snowball within the French-held territories. By March 1943, French Guiana had flat-out joined the Allied cause, Guadeloupe was looking like it was about to head the same way, and Martinique seemed poised on the verge of a civil war. It had pretty much only not gone over to the Allies at this point because of Admiral Robert and the elites of the island who were still devoted to the Vichy government. The Vichy government themselves, thinking, thanks to some rather strategically placed leaks, that an Allied invasion of the area was going to be planned quite soon, ordered all ships, aircraft, and gold reserves, which were sitting aboard a number of French ships, to be all sent to the bottom. But by this point in time, Admiral Robert was beginning to see which way things were going, and in June 1943 he announced that the territories that remained under his control at the time would be turned over to the Free French, which was solidified when the Free French destroyer Le Terrible arrived to visit, with Free French officers and personnel to replace him. Some sabotage was conducted to the various French military assets in the region, but it was largely perfunctory. Béarn, for example, was beached and partially flooded, but they did the job in such an unenthusiastic way that Béarn was refloated, made to work good enough to get to the United States for a refit, and headed off to said refit before the year was out. The first Free French officials in charge belonged to the lesser-known Giraudist group, who supported General Henri Giraud, who was in the somewhat odd position of being Free French, but pro-Vichy, but anti-German. But this state of affairs only lasted for a few months, and by the end of the year, the much more familiar to the rest of us Gaullist faction was in control. Whilst this was going on, the U-boat offensive had been petering out. More and more anti-submarine warfare assets were now present, including both first and second generation purpose-built anti-submarine warfare vessels, variously corvettes, frigates, or destroyer escorts, depending on whose classification system you're using, along with substantial numbers of K2 class anti-submarine warfare blimps, and fleets of PBY Catalinas, along with PBM Mariners, and more importantly, the crews of these various anti-submarine assets were now relatively experienced in the ways to find and kill submarines. And in addition, surface and air-to-surface radar was becoming more and more common, and the use of convoys was developing to a point that the U-boats were being forced to try and come to the merchant ships, and thus have to try and fight their way past the escorts, rather than just lie in wait and hope for something to come by them. If you want to hear a particularly amusing story about one such encounter, look for the video I did on the Royal Canadian Navy in World War II, particularly the section surrounding HMCS Oakville. Nevertheless, as a result, shipping losses in 1943 in the Caribbean were less than 35% of what they had been in 1942. The need for submarines in other theatres would see the number of German subs deployed there start to decline, although significant Allied resources would also remain in the area to guard against the few that remained and against the possibility that large numbers of them might come back. As a result, the last successful attack by German submarines would be in July 1944, when an American tanker was sunk, with the final score at that point being about 400 merchant ships sunk in the Caribbean, the majority of which had been sunk in 1942, with just over 100 submarines, 97 German and a few Italian, participating, of which 17 were lost in direct operations in the area, and about half as many again in transit across the Atlantic, going to or from the operational zone. So hopefully that gives you a quick overview as to the basic situation in the Caribbean in World War II. It's an often forgotten theatre of operations, but an incredibly vital one, and indeed one that, had the Germans been able to concentrate slightly more resources on it, it's been argued by some historians might actually have caused the Allies significant problems in 1942 and 43. But as it wasn't to be, and it also provides an interesting microcosm of the relationship between Vichy France and its outlying colonies and the Allies during the mid-war period. Nonetheless, hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you again in another video soon.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.